This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. Kevin is a retired United States Army Lieutenant Colonel who has studied UFOs for more than 50 years. His military training has provided him with unique insight into military operations and UFO research. Kevin has investigated many of the most mysterious cases and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries and been interviewed on hundreds of radio and television programs about UFOs. Considered to be one of the leading experts on the Roswell UFO crash, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including Roswell in the 21st Century and Encounter in the Desert, a re-examination of the Socorro UFO landing. Now here's the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And hello and welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am in fact Kevin Randle. I'll be joined by my guest Susan Swiatek in just a moment. But I wanted to explain something, and I've kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. On August 10th, we had coming through here what was called a derecho, which is defined as an inland hurricane. Top wind speeds were 145 miles an hour. Now, it's not a hurricane in the sense that you get a lot of rain and it lasts for hours and hours. It was a short-lived storm, but it did major damage here. Our county was 98% of the people in our county lost power. We lost the cable, and the other counties had equal damage. We just were hit the worst, but other counties had similar damage. I think like 4,000 telephone poles were knocked down, which took out the power, and I was without power for days and days and days. And when we finally got it back, we had no cable, therefore no internet. And once we got that back up going, something else happened and we lost the internet again. And I was doing what I needed to do in the grocery store and this little restaurant they have where they were allowing us to use their Wi-Fi to do email and things like that, but couldn't do the radio show from there. So we've had to use kind of the best of for a number of weeks here. And I kind of wanted to apologize, but there's really nothing that we could do about it given the circumstances. I think we're to the point where that has all been worked out and will be good to run now with new shows for quite a while, as long as I can find guests. They'll agree to come on the show, which is a whole nother story, by the way. But anyway, I wanted to make it clear that it was circumstances beyond my control that caused the kind of the gap in putting out new programs. We got a couple in there as things worked out, and then we lost the cable again. But we're now, I hope, good to go forever at this point. As I said, I'm going to be joined by Susan Swiatek. She was born in Washington, D.C., but she spent years growing up in Denver, Colorado. And I mention that only because I grew up in Denver, Colorado. Actually, Aurora, and I'm sure she knows where that is. And since 1970, she's been living near Fairfax, Virginia. And as a child, she read everything in the school library on UFOs and other anomalies. And in 1966, when Barney and Betty Hill's Interrupted Journey exploded under the pages of Look magazine, I remember that, she was hooked on UFOs and abductions. She has been greatly influenced by the writings of researchers Budd Hopkins and Dr. David Jacobs, whom she later knew as colleagues and friends. She holds a BFA degree from the Maryland Institute College of Art, Baltimore, and followed up that with a 6-month technology immersion program. She's worked extensively supporting various federal agencies in the DoD and health agencies as a technical editor and quality assurance. Along the way, she met folks from the DC-based Fund for UFO Research, FUFOR, as we who like acronyms call it, and worked with such legendary nightcap researchers as Dick Hall, Don Berliner, and Dr. Bruce Maccabee. Rob Swiatek was on the FUFOR Executive Committee, and it's obvious how that meeting turned out since they ended up getting married. And they've been married since 1994. Susan organized the 1999 MUFON International Symposium just outside Washington, D.C. in Arlington, Virginia. And she has served on the MUFON Virginia State Director since the summer of 2003, and she holds monthly meetings either in person or virtually through Zoom. Susan collaborated with others to launch the electronic magazine Journal of Abduction Encounter Research, JAR, in 2007 and developed the art for its masthead. JAR continues today in a reborn online incarnation. She organized an annual conference for the International Fortean Organization, INFO, since 19. I've just fallen into the 20th century, folks. Since 2014, as well as sponsoring local UFO conferences and speakers. She has lectured widely, and her artwork appears in many books such as Ron Story's Extraterrestrial Encyclopedia and Dick Hall's UFO Evidence Part 2. She has created many covers for FUFOR and the UFO Research Coalition projects. She created the cover for and performed QC and pre-press work for Delphos, a coalition publication dealing with the extensive evidence and the importance of 1971 Delphos, Kansas physical trace case. I went through that whole long thing for one reason, people. There are very few women involved in UFO research that we can bring on the program, and I search for them quite a bit because I think it's important to involve everybody. But here's a woman with great credentials and has a long history in UFO research, and I think we're going to have a good conversation about that now that I've wasted so much time on it. Susan Swiatek, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
I thought we talked about, communicated about things that we would like to talk about on this. And I think the first thing I wanted to get into is, you knew Don Berliner, you of course knew Stan Friedman, you know me.
Right.
And Don Berliner and Stan Friedman wrote a book called Crash at Corona, which is about the Roswell UFO crash. And they couldn't use UFO crash at Roswell because Don Schmitt and I got that title first.
Right.
But there were some problems with that book, not to mention the plagiarism that shows up repeatedly in it, which we won't go into in depth. But one of their main witnesses was Gerald Anderson, who claimed as a 5-year-old boy he'd been on the plains of San Augustine, seen the crash UFO, seen the archaeologists that showed up there, and with his family had been threatened by the military. There was a controversy about that. We learned that Gerald Anderson had been less than candid in some of his dealings with people and basically forged a couple of documents and that sort of thing. Right. What was the relationship between Don Berliner and Stan Friedman? Do you have a feeling for that? And why was Don Berliner brought in to help Stan with the book?
Exactly. Well, I think that they had a pretty good friendship going with the book. Maybe it got strained at times, but in fact, we were asking at the time, Don, why did Stan reach out to you? He goes, because Stan really can't write. That was his explanation at the time. So that's how Don got involved, because of course that's his main thing. He's a writer 100%, and mostly in conventional aviation and space titles, not so much in UFOs, though he's written a few. Obviously, he served on the in NICAP and certainly on the head of the Fund for UFO Research at times. So he certainly checked out with UFOs. But that was what I was told. Now, they seem to have a real push-pull and kind of kept it together. And I think the problem with the Gerald Anderson material is they didn't have much time between the deadline and when they got that material. I got the impression at the time that Don Berliner wished that they had more time to vet it, but it was one of these things, we have to be first, get it in the book. They got it in the book. No sooner had they got it in the book and the book was out that that's when Don had the, buyer's remorse, and he just wanted to write a very, very damning and complete statement, just separating themselves from the Gerald Anderson material. But, it's one of these things that it seemed like Stan was not too congenial about that, and he really pushed back on that. But the point is, that's when their friendship really frayed. And Don said, we've got to get this out there. So they finally got a repudiation out there. But, no sooner had the ink dried on that, and, then you have Stan Friedman kind of cozying up to the Gerald Anderson story again and kind of repudiating the repudiation. So after that, I don't think they spoke much. Don is still alive and kicking. He's in Michigan somewhere, and, still has all his faculties. When he moved, I guess it's been about a year now, we were there like the last weekend. He was in the Washington area, and seen him pack up his last few items. But so he's still, as far as I know, he's sharp as a tack, still going strong. At least a couple months ago, I was aware of that. We have these little confabs in Kalamazoo, and he's threatened to show up a couple times, though he never has. And then, of course, COVID has settled in on all of us. So I haven't seen Don, and maybe it's been a year and a half, because it was in the summer when he moved. But and he drove himself to Michigan, so he's still, you could still probably get him in a conversation. But anyway, yeah, that was an interesting time,
Don,
with them sort of breaking up over that.
Well, Don had an opportunity to meet Gerald Anderson in person. They went to, I think, Stan and Don went to New Mexico, and Gerald Anderson was showing him the alleged crash site on the plains of San Augustine near Forest Springs and that sort of thing. I don't understand the timing of this thing. It doesn't seem like there was that big of a push that he would have had time to vet Anderson. Don and I was the first one to talk to Anderson, as a matter of fact. And Don and I rejected his tale pretty quickly because we had found some significant discrepancies in it. And that our book came out long before, maybe not long, but months before Crash at Corona. So there was some problem with the Anderson story there. And we had this conference in Chicago, and Don and Stan were both there to extensively or ostensively talk about the Gerald Anderson story. Anderson was invited to be there to hold up his end of the discussion and refused to show up. So I'm a little bit confused about this timing thing. It seemed that they would have had more, and I think Don Berliner would have done it, had more time to vet Anderson. But I think Stan wanted Anderson's tale in the book because here's a guy who was talking about firsthand knowledge or firsthand witnessing the bodies over on the plains of San Augustine, and Stan's baby was this second crash over on the plains of San Augustine. But I thought that was interesting that Anderson claimed to have been a Navy SEAL, for example, and then we found out that wasn't true. And I showed Stan the information on it that Anderson hadn't been a Navy SEAL, and that he still was endorsing the Gerald Anderson tale after Anderson admitted forging the phone bills to make me look bad, forging other documents to kind of bolster his story and that sort of thing. So I was a little bit surprised about that. I remember the phone bills were crucial to this whole thing, or somehow. Once someone forges something, that's it. But, I mean, we have these through ufology all the time. We have people holding on to Larry for the longest time over Rendlesham. We have so many personalities like that. We have the Bob Lazars, and they always seem to find a champion who has a relatively good reputation, like buoying them up, with all these characters. That part is always, I think once people invest a certain amount of emotional energy in a witness, they really have a hard time dropping it. And we've seen that over and over. But anyway, not to beat that dead horse. Well, I'm going to beat it a little bit more because, frankly, I can.
Okay.
The thing that got me, and I mentioned the plagiarism, there's a long section of an interview with Bill Brazel in the book Crash at Corona. And it's an interview that Don Schmidt and I conducted. Neither Stan nor Don Berliner were there. It's in our book first. And we had sent, I guess we'd sent a copy of the audio tape, because there's only an audio tape of it, to the Fund for UFO Research. And I don't know whether they used that as the basis for it, but they published this without any credit or attribution of where it came from, which was really kind of annoying. But what they did, and I shouldn't say they, what Stan did was insert a word into the interview, a crucial word, because we're talking about the four guys that came to visit Bill Brazel. Bill Brazel said that he had some pieces of debris, and that he had been showing them around in Corona, New Mexico, debris of the crashed UFO. And I'm going to have to stop myself there because I'm coming up against the time constraints. I will finish the tale after we take this quick break, but I do want to thank those of you who have purchased the Best of Project Blue Book, which is my latest book on UFOs. It's been up and down on the Amazon bestseller list. If you enjoyed it, please rate it, because that kind of helps, and write a review if you like the book, because that helps spread the word, and it shows people what's going on in the world of UFOs. And be sure to take a look at Encounter in the Desert and Roswell in the 21st Century. We will be back right after this with Susan Swiatek talking about UFOs, so stick around. Susan Swiatek, and when I say here, it means we're conversing, but we are practicing social distancing in this world of COVID virus. I mention that so you don't think we're violating any rules by being in the same room chatting with one another, although I don't think either one of us is infected. When we went away, I was dominating the conversation with my tale of Bill Brazel. Now, he's the son of the rancher who found the crash near Corona, New Mexico, the Roswell crash, picked up pieces of debris and was showing them around in a bar in Corona. And a few days later, some Air Force people showed up wanting to, well, basically confiscate the debris he had. And Brazel told Don Schmidt and me about this when we interviewed him in New Mexico in 1989. And the point was, it was clear what was going on. Now, that whole conversation was published in UFO Crash at Roswell, and then parts of it were published in Crash at Corona. But what Stan had done, and I say Stan because I don't think Don Berliner would have done this, we're talking about the description of the people who had come to visit Bill Brazel. And Brazel was always clear that it was 4 white soldiers. Stan inserted the word black between in the context of this story, that one of the individuals was black, a black NCO, black sergeant, had come out with this Captain Anderson, or I think it was Anderson was the name he gave. He wasn't sure what it was. Armstrong, Captain Armstrong. He wasn't sure the name. So what he had done was alter the context of the discussion by inserting this word. And when he was asked about it by another guy, and this is, for those of you who are interested, you can follow up on it on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, because I did a long segment about this. But Friedman had said that Bill Brazel used a racially charged word when he was describing the sergeant. And I'm sure you all can figure out what that racially charged word would be. But he didn't say that. And I have the tape, which proves it. But I also called Bill and asked him about it specifically. And Bill Brazel said, no, he didn't think there was not a black soldier with him. They were all the white soldiers. And that kind of manipulation of the data, and I think he did that to underscore the validity of the Gerald Anderson testimony, because Anderson was talking about a black NCO who was very mean that came out to the plains of San Augustine when they were found there. So it was another problem with the story. But okay. I thought it was interesting, and Susan, you can jump in with your observations here. I thought it was interesting that Don Berliner wrote the book, and Stan then complained that he didn't have enough time to review the galley proofs or the page proofs before it went to press. So any mistakes that were made like that, he always kind of blamed on Don Berliner.
Well, it's funny because I know Don would not have inserted a word like that. I mean, that does not, I just can't imagine. I mean, the Don Berliner that I know and is still around, I just can't see him doing something like that. So I mean, I don't want to, put, coals on the head of the dead here. And we stayed good friends with Stan all these years. And, sorry to see him go in such a way. He didn't even get to say goodbye to his wife. But in any case, that is more of the kind of style that, Stan would probably have had. But, he's done a couple stunts over the years that were kind of disturbing. But overall, a good friend and a good
since you mentioned some disturbing stunts, what give us an example of a disturbing stunt?
Let's see. I don't have the particulars in front of me, but I remember the fund had a research article. Anyway, and it was out there. We had distributed it for a year with a limited press or something, and then it was. It was out of press. Let's face it, the fund, we were all volunteers. We did have an organization that mailed stuff out for us. But, there's a lot of work to do, as you know. And, the website was just barely there in these early days. And there's a lot of work for individual volunteers to do. And we weren't selling it anymore. We just didn't have it anymore. So Stan just put his own cover on it and started selling it, and it's just Stephen Greer did the same thing. It just seems like we're kind of caught with that. But so he started distributing. Well, we got to get it out there. It's this whole thing. When somebody owns material, no matter how you really think it should be out there or not, it's not your decision to make to just slap a new cover on it and sell it. And so we've run into that a couple times with, and sometimes it's just we just weren't able to get it out there again and get another printing done. And sometimes there was a reason why we were not distributing something, like maybe something needed to be taken back and changed. Maybe there was an error that we found. So it's not really, what if I took one of your books from 8 years ago, slapped a new cover on it, started selling it? You would not like that. Because first of all, you'd say, that's my material. Second of all, you'd say, you know what, I wrote a book that cleaned up a lot of the misconceptions in that book, and I don't like that old information going out. So things like that. But once we said stop, he did stop. So unlike Stephen Greer, who had to have an attorney send him a note, but that's another story for another day. But but anyway, that's just the type of thing sometimes that would happen.
Well, I know that Stan was a big proponent of MJ12, and Don Berliner got the operations manual, what is it, a SM 101, in the mail in a similar fashion
or whatever,
in a similar fashion that the original document showed up. And if I remember correctly, Don thought it was a hoax. Don didn't think much of it, but Stan took it and ran with it as well. Is that?
Yeah, that was another thing that disturbed Don. But once again, the truth is somewhere in between. Like Don Berliner put a lid on it. We talk about a lid with Biden here, but he really put a lid on it and said, let's sit on this thing and really think about it. But that didn't sit well with the rest of the fund, because they said, we can't just sit on it. This is a hot potato. We need to get it vetted and get it circulating among important, and get it out there. So
let me interrupt here.
Here we go again.
You said something that was very important. We need to get it vetted. And that's the one thing I see lacking in UFO research is vetting the people.
Right. And what happened with Don, with his SOM1 or whatever the heck it was, I remember Don finally gave it up, so to speak, gave up the sitting on it idea when people were saying, Don, they're selling copies of it at gun shows. And that's when he finally had to realize that, the cat was out of the bag a long time ago. And, it's time to.
Do you know how they got to the gun shows? I asked this question because I got a call from a friend many, many years ago and said there was an MJ12 document at the local gun show. So I went to the gun show and saw it. So yes, they were selling it at gun shows. I never understood how he got it. But you don't know how
it's a very strange process. I mean, who knows what the hell's going on with these things? But for a long time, it was like a genie in the bottle. It was captured. It wasn't really circulating. A couple, people got it in the mail or it showed up in their mailbox or whatever it was, and that was it. It wasn't really circulating. I think it was a film, wasn't it? Film. I think that SOM1 was showed up as film.
Yeah, it was 35 millimeter film. I think it was the same way that the original MJ12 document showed up. Allegedly to Jamie Shandera's house.
Ironically, in 1987, that was my big debut on organized ufology. I just wandered down to American University here in Washington, and the fund had paired up with MUFON to host the symposium at American University. And I was just, fresh out of college and just, wet behind the ears. And I was like, wow, this is so exciting. And MJ12 was being muttered in the hallways, and you felt like the scales are coming off everyone's eyes. Disclosure. We didn't use that term, but the government has to come forward. Everybody's talking MJ12, and it was just really a fascinating time. Especially me just walking in as a neophyte in as far as organizers ufology goes. I kept up with the reading all these years because back then you could read everything, pretty much. But anyway, that was a whole new thing. Stan Friedman was swaggering around, and it was MJ12 was all over the place. But yeah, it's interesting how that burst on the scene, and here we are today. Kevin? Let me ask you, what is your take on Roswell today? I heard that you're gotten more jaded. And,
well, let's put that on the back burner for a moment. Because I had an agenda here, which we've diverted from. But I was going to bring that up, and I'll certainly answer that question before we get done. But the thing I understood was the film, it showed up as undeveloped film to Don Berliner, and he had to have the film developed. And so that's why I don't understand. And I don't understand how the manual got out into another arena, because clearly it's all from the same generation of copies.
Right, and he really had a clamp on that thing. I mean, he was very very particular about it. I mean, he would hand the document around, the printed version, at the meetings, but then he'd always want it back. He just wanted to sit on it. It's like, Don, you can't sit on it forever. We have to have some other eyes on this thing. And, I don't know. It's just hard to imagine when people don't understand. Like before the internet was really as strong as it is today and so forth. Now we think, well, you could never put a lid on something like that. It might last 24 hours. But no, it lasted for weeks. I don't know how long, maybe months even, several weeks. And then, like I said, go ahead.
Well, it's my impression that Don Berliner believes it's a hoax. Is that correct?
I think he thought it was a very good hoax. Now, later, I can't go into it, but later, I can't go into it because of time. But as I sent you my regular resume too. I mean, I worked at USAPA, U.S. Army Publishing Agency. It was a full agency at that time, and we dealt with a lot of very old legacy material. And so structurally, I always thought it was very interesting. If this is a phony, which it probably is, but it was done very well. It matched up well with that time period and how documents looked.
Oh, there's no question about whoever wrote it had a sample of what these Army manuals looked like to
Correct.
Follow along and put it together in that respect. But I just wanted to make sure that I was on the same page with Don Berliner that this is probably a hoax. I think the whole MJ-12 thing is a hoax, going back even to the Eisenhower briefing documents, and I think my audience knows well where I stand on that. Although when I first saw the documents, I was very impressed with them, and I thought, this is great. This is wonderful. This is wonderful to have this kind of a document. But then I found the fatal flaw, and I think everybody else has found what they think of as a fatal flaw as well. And for those of you who are interested, yes, it's on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and I think I call it the fatal flaw in the MJ-12 Eisenhower briefing document. Look up Eisenhower briefing document. Since you brought up,
I think a lot of us feel like this was an emulation of potentially what the working group would look like, and maybe this was a way to leak the concept out. I don't know. It's an idea.
If we look at what Brad Sparks and Barry Greenwood, I think it was, presented at a MUFON conference about how that whole thing came about, and the Bob Pratt secret papers, and how this was actually designed as a novel by Bill Moore and Richard Doty long before the MJ-12 papers showed up. And now we see the whole thing in the MJ-12 papers come out as they were created for this novel that they apparently couldn't sell at some point. And they brought in Bob Pratt, I think, as the writer for that. We're going to have to take a break here in a moment. I'm just going to preface this a little bit because you brought up Roswell, and in the things that we were going to talk about, you wanted to talk about the Ramey memo, and I've done a lot of work on that. Not that I wanted to. I keep getting dragged into that one. And your impressions of it, maybe we can come to some consensus of what's going on with the Ramey memo and that sort of thing. And I also wanted to point out that there are some other fine programs about the paranormal on the X-Zone Broadcast Network at xzbn.net. I stumble over that because I want to say xzbn.net to keep my pals in Canada and England happy about that. But you go to the website. There's an awful lot of interesting listings on the side. You can see what programs would interest you and have some fun doing that as well. So you are listening to A Different Perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. I'm here with Susan Swiatek. We will be back to talk about the Ramey memo right after this, so please stick around. I am here with Susan Swiatek. We're talking about UFOs. She's the Virginia State Director for MUFON, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit as well, maybe about some of the interesting cases going on in Virginia with the MUFON. But when we went away, I had mentioned, I think we'd kind of dealt with MJ12 to the point where we didn't need to talk about it anymore. I think everybody knows my feelings on it, and I think most people understand that this was a hoax. It was an interesting hoax, and it certainly gathered an awful lot of attention into the UFO community when it was released. But turns out there were many problems with it. And as I say, take a look at my blog, and you'll be able to see some of that. But when we went away, I'd mentioned this Ramey memo. Now, in 1947, the 518th Bomb Group, which is the organization that found the UFO or had it brought to them in Roswell, New Mexico, was a subordinate unit to the 8th Air Force, which was headquartered in Fort Worth, Texas. General Roger Ramey was a commanding officer of the 8th Air Force at the time, and they brought some of the debris from New Mexico to Fort Worth so that General Ramey could look at it. Now, there are a number of photographs taken in General Ramey's office. There's actually 7 of them. 6 taken by a fellow named J. Bond Johnson, who was a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And then a 7th one, and I suspect it was taken by the public information officer at the base because it doesn't match the quality of the photographs taken by the reporter. There's a difference in the lighting. There's a difference in a lot of things. And you can see stuff had been moved around. But in one of the pictures, actually in 2 of the pictures taken with General Ramey, he's holding a piece of paper in his hand. One of them you can't really see much, but the other one, the way he's holding it and the way the photographs work, when you blow up the picture, you can begin to see words on it. You can begin to see the writing on it. And since the mid-1990s, there's been a great controversy about the Ramey memo. What's on the Ramey memo? Can we read the Ramey memo? And I know I've been involved in a couple of high-tech examinations of the memo. And I think Stan at one time got the cleanest scan of the memo, a photographic scan, so that it could be researched by others. And you were talking about, I think, when you saw the memo, tell me about how you actually saw the memo for the first time and what your impressions were.
Yeah, I remember seeing those original photographs, of course, with Roswell in Ramey's office and all that, or the Ramey's holding it up or whatever. But, you never really saw it clear enough to think that piece of paper in his hand could have possibly had to do with the Roswell incident. But later, when I believe it was in a hotel, I think it was at a MUFON conference, Rob and I can't remember, but we were in a hotel room, and that's when Stan brought it out. And it was quite large, what he had, and it was much more detailed than you'd ever seen before. And you could make out several words. I think it was about the disc, and I think it was, I thought it said, I think I came up with victims. That was the word that I came up with. And that's, of course, not everybody agrees, but I feel definitely, to me, it indicated that it was about the Roswell crash. There was a disc. A lot of, you can pick out a lot of keywords, and I thought it said victims. That was my impression. But, of course, I could be subject to error here because everybody's kind of picking at it. But, I have an art background, and I worked in the darkroom quite a bit. And there is, unlike digital photography, which is extremely, these days, the pixels are amazing. But back then, really, you're at the limit of what the silver halide crystals can do. And there's only so much you can do. And like you said, it's beyond the imagery. The only research that really can be done would be the linguistic study of potential words and the types of words that would have been used by the author. And I think that's the only approach that is left to be taken with this.
Well, I think the thing that I've always said is that there are words you can read with a magnifying glass on a good copy of it. I think weather balloon shows up, Fort Worth, Texas shows up,
right.
but Ramey is holding it in his hand, and it's kind of crunched in his hand, and it's not really facing the camera, and there's kind of folds in it, so that kind of blurs things out a little bit. But there's words you can see, and given the timing, given where Ramey is, the logical assumption is this deals with the Roswell crash. but it was not taken by 35 millimeter film. I think you mentioned 35 millimeter film. It was on a speed graphic camera, and I think it was a 4x5 negative. So it was a large. It's not that big. It's not that big. What is it? 2x3 negative. I've seen the negative. I've actually seen the negative.
I think it's 2x3, but I still think you are just coming up against the limits of molecules and so forth.
I know that there has been a study done where they were using magnifying equipment that took it down basically to the molecular level and tried to read it that way. And you get to the point where there's going to be nothing more you can do. We've magnified it. We've scanned it. We've done everything we can using our modern technology. And I've seen some of the scanning going on, and it takes literally hours to scan the negative. And what they do is they scan the whole negative instead of just that one small portion. They want to have the whole context in place for it.
Right.
But when I know that, and I should mention David Rudiak, because he's done an awful lot of work on that, and he is a strong proponent of victims of the wreck.
I think it's victims of the wreck. That's how I see it.
The problem is, and David wasn't. David was trying to come up with words that began with a V that fit the number of letters that you could see there, and there weren't many. But somebody in an examination of it, and I think this was on it was on the program with Josh Gates in his Expedition Unknown, looking at the Ramey memo, and I was there and I got to meet Josh Gates, which is the only reason I went to do it. I wanted to meet Josh Gates because I've been watching his show on the Sci-Fi Channel. But in looking at that, and one of the guys in the scans they had made, it came up with the idea. It said viewing of the wreck, and it fits the criterion of the number of letters that would be in letters in the wording of it. And if it says viewing of the wreck, that really changes the whole context, because victims implies there was some kind of crew, and viewing says we just saw it. Doesn't say anything about a crew. And so that's one of the key words, and it has not been defined to the point where you can say victims of the wreck. And I've looked at the thing many times, and I've looked at it in many different levels of magnification under many different scans, including a couple of times at the special collections at the University of Texas at Arlington. And I can see it both ways. It depends on my mood. I can see viewing, I can see victims of the wreck. But the problem is it's kind of faces in the clouds. We're kind of seeing what we want to see.
Yeah, I agree. You could take it either way. I mean, it's not definitive either way. Definitely not definitive either way. But something happened, something big happened, and those well-placed people, I don't think, would have been fooled by a weather balloon. And plus the amount of debris, and the animals wouldn't cross it. That just wouldn't be the thing with a mogul balloon train. The mogul balloon is just like a weather balloon, bigger and bigger and longer, but it doesn't really have a lot of exotic materials. At least that's my understanding. I remember Rob was talking a lot to the author of those two reports. The Roswell report, Fact versus Fiction, and Case Closed. Captain James McAndrew. Yeah,
he was talking to McAndrew or Colonel Weaver.
I believe it was McAndrew, the young guy, that his office was only like 50 feet from Rob's office at the time. Very strange. But he was able to have him just bring out of the building part of a mogul balloon target, and Rob took those pictures, which of course have been used in a lot of different books now. But it just wasn't. I just can't see anybody being really thrown for a loop on that, and just. Of course, it varies, depends on the witness about how big the debris field was. But we understand it was big enough and dense enough that the animals wouldn't cross it. So I have a hard time with, mogul balloons. There's not much to it. It's mostly space and then strings, and there's not much to it. It's tall, but it doesn't really amount to much. So I don't know. That's been my thing. And then originally, all those shipments. So many people were shipping, large transport vehicles were going all around, and why would that be happening if this was just a mistake? I just can't see that press release being written over a fancy weather balloon. But anyway, that's always been my take on it. And then, of course, we have the search later. Go ahead.
Well, the one thing about the mogul balloon, and we have to thank Colonel Richard Weaver, who was the leader of the Air Force investigation. We have him to thank, is he found Dr. Albert Crary's field notes and then his regular diary on the flights and published those in the Air Force report. So if you go through the Air Force report, you can find all of that stuff. And what's important is the only flight that's missing is flight number 4, and there's no record of it. It wasn't mentioned in the records because it didn't fly. Crary's diary says no flight today because of clouds. They were not allowed to fly in cloudy weather because of the long array train. By the time they got to New Mexico, and the things that they published have been kind of deceptive, the length of the array train had been reduced to about 400 feet as opposed to the 600 feet that they were flying back east. But they were not allowed to fly at night, and they were not allowed to fly in cloudy weather because these things would pose a threat to aerial navigation. So Dr. Crary's diary says the flight was canceled. So there was no flight number 4. And
John
to me,
Steiger brings that out in his book.
Pardon me, who does?
No, John Steiger, with his recent book that he came out, the UFO trilogy, Dramas for the Stage. He has a Roswell trial courtroom drama in there with the characters, and that's one thing that's brought up, that flight number 4 never happened. They made a note of it, that the conditions were not good, and then the other side of the coin is, but they waited a few hours and conditions improved, and then they did launch it. Well, I don't see any evidence for that. That's just somebody saying that conditions improved. It was, when he made his notes, he did it a little premature because really it was launched. But I still don't think, it doesn't matter what's written in the log there. To me, it just doesn't explain the deposit on the ranch, the debris field, that even the smallest description that people have, it just doesn't, in my mind, it just doesn't comport with a mogul balloon train. It's not working for me.
Well, I think the thing we have to remember is Dr. Crary was the leader of the expedition. He knew what was going on. He said the flight was canceled. End of story. I don't understand why the skeptics do not understand that. I covered it at length in Roswell in the 21st Century. There was a long, detailed explanation of all of this in an appendix about the mogul balloon. What happened was, and Charles Moore, who was also involved in the mogul launches in New Mexico, I talked to him a couple of times, been to his house, as a matter of fact, in Socorro, told me that once the balloons were inflated, they couldn't get the helium back out of the balloon. So when the flight was canceled, they had to do something with the balloons. And what they would do is they would launch a small cluster of balloons, maybe with one microphone on it, to test various things. And there's descriptions in other parts of the documentation of what the cluster of balloons is. So when they say, well, they launched it later, no, they didn't. They launched a small cluster of balloons, 3 or 4 balloons lifting something up, not a mogul array. And there is absolutely no documentation of any data being recovered from flight number 4. Flight number 4 was canceled. It did not fly. It cannot possibly be the explanation for the events in Roswell. So I always like to make that clear, but I sometimes get overly enthusiastic in my defense of them picking up something that was other than the mogul balloon.
Right. Well, so, I did have that. I know we're probably out of time, but I just had that one anecdote, which is just a tiny little thing that does add to the credence to the Roswell incident of being of something of import.
Well,
and, I don't have time for it.
I will note that we'll note that McAndrew called me a number of times, and he kept saying, "You can tell me the truth. You don't really believe this, do you?" And you can really? Go back on it. It's just between us. And I thought, no, that's not the way it is. Yeah, you're right on the time, though. We're getting right up against it. You are listening to a different perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. I'm joined by Susan Swiatek. We're talking UFOs. We're talking Roswell and a lot of other things. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. We are back. I am here with Susan Swiatek. We're talking UFOs. We've been talking Roswell. She posed a question to me a while back that I didn't answer, and I said I would answer it later on in the program. And if I don't do it now, it's not going to get answered. When I did Roswell in the 21st century, I was looking at it as a cold case. Let's take all the information that has been gathered by all the various sources and all the various researchers and all the various pieces of it, put it all together and see if we can distill something. And by this point, we'd seen that some of the really credible witnesses, that what we thought were credible, Glenn Dennis, for example, talking about the caskets and the nurse who told him about the autopsy or the preliminary autopsy at the base, had fallen by the wayside because we couldn't verify the nurse's name. He gave us a name. We tried to verify it. And I should point out Vic Golubic spent a great deal of time and effort looking for it, as did some of the rest of us, and could not find any reference to a nurse by the name Naomi Self in the Army records. And they had records of like 125,000 nurses that had served in the military. And when confronted with that, well, Glenn Dennis changed his story. And that, to me, just killed his credibility. So I look at all of that in the Roswell in the 21st century. And what I concluded was the information that we had in the early 1990s, which was very robust and filled with really wonderful witnesses, wasn't quite as robust as I had thought. And some of the witnesses weren't quite as credible as we had hoped. I look at Colonel Edwin Easley, however. He was the provost marshal being the chief of police on the base, or like the chief of police, told me specifically, I asked him in a conversation, I said to him, I said, are we following the right path? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he said, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path. Now, here's a guy who's very credible. I have no reason to doubt what he's saying. So when I look at all of this stuff, I say, I got this very credible guy. Bill Brazel talking about picking up the pieces of the debris, very credible guy. So we have those sorts of things going on there. Could it have been something of terrestrial manufacture? Certainly. Do I think it was of terrestrial manufacture? Probably not. But I'm not willing now to take that big leap to say this absolutely proves extraterrestrial visitation. I lean in that direction, but I don't have what I would like to make that final leap to the extraterrestrial. So I stand back a little bit from where I did years ago and say, it's a very interesting case. Everybody agrees something fell at Roswell. The disagreement is exactly what it was. I know it wasn't Mogul. I have seen no other experimentation or any other explanation from a terrestrial source that would explain it. That, for me, is interesting, but just not enough for me to leap over into the extraterrestrial camp. That, Susan, is my explanation or my answer to your question.
All right. Well, thanks for filling us in on that. I will get your latest book. I will get your latest book, and I have to say I'm a little bit more in the extraterrestrial camp than you, but I've been troubled by so many wacky so-called witnesses that have fallen apart. The Glenn Dennis thing with the German nurse, that really broke my heart when that fell apart, because he always seemed so unreliable. But whatever.
Well, that's the thing, and he just. It was clear he was making up the tale. I know that Tom Carey still accepts the story. I don't think Don Schmidt is quite as happy with it as he was at one time. But I wanted to get quickly into is it John Guerra's biography of George Filer, Strange Craft?
Oh yeah, that's another friend of mine that was a Washingtonian, and. Anyway, yeah, it was interesting. That was an interesting book. But I agreed with your take on it. I read your review of it. You wished that he had gotten more detailed and more involved in some of what he had to say. It was kind of like an easy read, once over lightly, almost an outline for a more detailed book. But it was enjoyable.
Let's take a step back here. What we're talking about here is the Fort Dix alien incident. The story is that, I think it was 1973, George Filer is assigned to the Air Force side of the Fort Dix complex, and I forget the name of I think McGuire Air Force Base, I think it is. So it's Fort Dix McGuire. And he arrives at work, and there's all these lights on the runway going on. I mean, on the ground, it's vehicles. And apparently supposedly an alien creature had gotten out of a UFO and was shot dead by a MP on the base, and George Filer didn't get to see the alien, as I understand it, but he heard the story and was going to be briefing a general, and things changed radically. Is that where we're going with this?
Yeah, that's the story. He arrives at 5 a.m. and he's thinking, I'm just going to brief the general like I always do. But holy cow, all this activity is going on. I'm sure usually it was a very sleepy briefing and not much had happened in the 24 hours. But in this case, big stuff was going on and people were just overflowing with stories talking about it. But yeah, one side shot the alien, but it crawled over to the other side. So became like a problem for both of the divisions there. But yeah, so he pulls this information together, interviews people, and he's waiting outside the general's door, and somebody comes out and says, "Don't worry about it, we've already briefed him." But the general beckons him in, and he says, "Here's my written report," and that's it, because you could not discuss top secret or above in his office because the fear of bugs. I thought that was really interesting. That was that was it. How dramatic is that? Here's the report. But what I am trying to piece together is when I saw George Filer talk about this, we paid him to do a talk and brought him down here for the Fun for UFO Research Christmas party one year, and he had fabulous slides, and one of them was a slide that he had taken himself, and it was a pile of snow with MPs standing with guns drawn, long guns, on the snow, and there was about 10 of them around this thing, some just standing on the ground. And he said that, and this is the part where I'm trying to piece this together. Apparently, the alien was shot, it was crawling around, whatever. That got removed and flown out of there. But apparently, it wasn't until the next day that they discovered this pod, or this small craft that the alien had used to come down from a larger craft. And that thing had to be guarded until they could pick it up, because in the book it's very pointed that the weather had been clear. Because when he was driving to the base, he thought, wow, the weather's perfectly clear. My God, all this activity looks like we've had an air crash, but that seems weird because, we had perfect weather. Why would we have an air crash? He was trying to piece it all together. Well, there was no snow on the ground that day, but then apparently the next day it just snowed a little, like an inch and a half, just enough, and they scraped all the snow together around this pod to conceal it, and then put MPs literally standing on the pile of snow. I mean, here's MPs guarding a pile of snow. I have to admit, it's a very curious photograph, and it does back up that something strange is going on. So that always really impressed me.
But you see no alien. George Filer saw no alien. And if you've got classified material that has been exposed, like in an aircraft accident, you have to guard that. So the fact you've got MPs guarding a pile of snow really doesn't lead us anywhere other than there was something classified hidden under the snow.
Right. Something strange definitely went on that had a lot of people excited. I believe Filer when he says that. And like you said, he didn't see the alien, but I don't believe. But there's other witnesses. Other witnesses have come forward, But
we don't have their names.
Yes, one worked with Dick Hall for quite a while, and he was around a lot, visiting a lot. And but the same old story is he had a pseudonym, and don't even ask me this. I don't even remember the pseudonym now. When you deal with people and you know the real name of the pseudonym, pretty soon you don't remember anything. So that was a guy that Dick Hall believed he checked out, but we met him, but I can't remember much about him now because it just sort of disappeared into the ether. He probably wasn't willing to come forward any more than just talking to Dick. And Dick was trying to find a way to work him into the program. But I know Dick and Don believe the McGuire situation did happen, and they had reasons for that. But that's all I know. I mean, I like Filer. I believe he's always been consistent on this story. So I don't know why the snow pile was left out of the book. They just talk about the previous day's activities. But that picture is really, really something. I mean, something weird's going on at the very least. And anyway, that's all I have to say with that.
Well, those of you who are interested, as she mentioned, I did do a review of the book because we had no power for so long, and I had it downloaded on my iPad so I could read it. And the thing that struck me is, unfortunately, there is no way for any of us to corroborate any of that. There's no real names of anybody that we can go to and say, like Roswell, we have literally 1,500 people who are assigned to the base, and we know who they are, and we've talked to many, many of them. But in this case, we just really don't know anybody, and we can't call somebody up and ask them what they saw or how they were involved. And I understand that in the world today, you'll get phone calls. Bill Brazel told me that periodically he'd get phone calls from drunks in bars at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, wanting to know if the story was true about the crash at Roswell. And so you've got people who would be bothering the witnesses endlessly to get their take on it. So you have to be very careful on that sort of thing. We're getting awful close to the end of time here, and I mean the program, not the Earth. Is there a quick Virginia UFO story you want to share with us? And I mean quick, something that's really excited you in the last year or so?
Yes, the last case I worked on, and I still haven't pushed the button and completed it, but a couple more things have to come into play. But it's right around the corner from my house, but less than a mile away. A mother, her husband works. She's a stay-at-home mom with 5 kids, which is very rare around here because it's too expensive for that. But she homeschools 5 children. But 3 of her children one night at 10 o'clock when they were supposed to be going to bed, they all started making a ruckus. And she finally made it up the stairs and looked out and did not see it. But I did we're not allowed to see anybody face-to-face, even though it's a mile away, but we did do a call with everyone in the room, all the kids in the room, and they all described the same thing. And it was 2 vehicles fairly close to the ground, and they were shaped like stop signs, but with the point up and the point down, and then the parallel sides to the right and the left were a little bit longer. And they had very curious lighting patterns, white and red, and they were very, very specific about how that was. And it's very strange, very low to the ground, so it wouldn't have been too many people witnessing it. But very good witnesses, excellent. They were really consistent, and the mother was very good about doing an excellent drawing with the aid of the children describing it. So I think that was a very, very strange, very strange thing.
How old were the children?
The children were very young. Well, it was 2, 10, and 13. Now, granted, the 2-year-old's not going to add much, but the 2-year-old's pointing and going, oh, yeah, so that's kind of like, out of the mouth of babes, you have that. But it had red and white lights. The woman even drew musical notes, and I asked her about that on the drawing, but she didn't hear anything. It wasn't musical, but she was trying to indicate how one light was going fast, quarter notes, the other one was more like a half note, and so forth. But it was red and white, and it was not bilaterally symmetrical at all, very strange. And they're both exactly the same. But they had this very flight pattern, almost like a butterfly, very strange flight pattern. I don't think that's the only thing I have to cross off is the drone angle. So I want to, but I don't think there's any drones that shape. But yeah, they were really good witnesses. She took a picture outside the window in different lighting conditions. I mean, she really did her job. She pointed out planets that were visible because she put her camera on like late game.
I have to cut you off. I have to cut you off because I'm really out of time here. I appreciate you being on the program. I appreciate all your insights to some of the aspects of the UFO community. Thank you very much for being here on A Different Perspective.
Thank you.
You have a good day. I do
too.
want to mention one last time, folks. Take a look at the Best of Project Blue Book. I think you'll find some interesting things in there that the Air Force didn't want us to see and probably didn't think we'd ever see because if the files were closed. You have been listening to A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network. I'll be back in about 167 hours, so thanks for tuning in and look for us in about a week.